Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And now to the papers as ever. And if you don't know what the main story is, you really need another cup of coffee. There's the Observer. Tory party at war as IDS allies slam immoral cuts. The take on the Sunday Telegraph, not so different. Knives out for Osborne in Tory backlash. We love a backlash. Mail on Sunday, outraged Cameron's four-letter tirade at fraud IDS. And the four-letter word is not Iain. Finally, Sunday Times, their IDS attack shreds unfit Osborne's dream of number 10. And finally, actually, there's the Independent, a very sad and a gloomy, melancholy front page, and rightly so, because this is the last ever print copy of the Independent on Sunday, a very fine newspaper. R.I.P. We'll talk about that as well. But we're going to start, I think, Matt, with the big spread in the Sunday Times about the Tory Civil War, which is very lucid.
Yes, there's a really good two-page spread which takes you through the whole series of events. And I have to say, the more you read, the more baffling it gets, because I still don't really understand why Iain Duncan Smith resigned. I mean, here was an issue that his department had put forward. It was an issue that he'd been offered the chance to discuss. He had written letters to his colleagues saying very recently, saying this was a policy they should support. And it appears that on the very day he resigned, the policy was going to be kicked into the long grass anyway. So he'd got what he wanted. So why then did he resign?
What's your answer? I mean, I'll ask you this, of course.
Well, I mean, my suspicion is that there are lots of things going on here. Peak has played a large part of it. The Brexit has, of course, amplified every emotion involved. But there's no doubt that what he is clearly trying to do is edge out the Chancellor and also, to an extent that I think hasn't quite really been given due emphasis, edge out the Prime Minister.
You think this is all directed ultimately against David Cameron? Do you think sort of Boris is behind this somehow? There's a plot of some kind?
I'd be amazed if Boris was behind. I don't think Boris does.
He's on the ski slope.
I don't think Boris does organised plots.
That's not
his.
Be honest with you.
That's not his style. But you know, to use a phrase he would, as a classicist, used cui bono. I mean, who is the beneficiary of all this anti-Cameron, anti-Osborne rhetoric? And
we should say that you are the man responsible for a lot of this, Matthew D'Ancona. I put it to you that in your book you quoted Osborne's attacking Iain Duncan Smith's intellect, and that's behind a lot of this.
Well, according
I hope you're proud of yourself.
I just report the news, you know.
Steve Richards.
The Observer headline. If you want to get an illustration of how multi-layered this story is, just look at the headline. Budget furore leaves Osborne counting cost as departure of Iain Duncan Smith threatens to widen Tory split on Brexit. So you get the budget, the budget furore, which incidentally we would be talking about now if this resignation hadn't happened for lots of reasons. The issue of Osborne's future is in the headline. Iain Duncan Smith's departure, and whether this is all to do with Brexit. There's incidentally a good photo of Iain Duncan Smith watching George Osborne's budget. He always stands from a distance. He never sits on the front bench. He's never sat on the front bench for Prime Minister's questions, and he looks on warily as this budget was being delivered. Incidentally, if it was a budget of a brilliant strategist, I doubt if a resignation would have been provoked 2 days later. I wonder the degree to which this is about Brexit, actually. I think it is in the sense that if Osborne had been part of the Out campaign, clearly he wouldn't be targeted in this way today. And because collective responsibility on the front bench of the Cabinet and elsewhere has been suspended, I think that changes the way politicians think and behave. But beyond that, I think it is about the issue. of the pressure relentlessly from the Treasury to cut the welfare budget, and only one element of it, not pensions and all the rest of it, one element of it. I think it is about that.
One of Iain Duncan Smith's allies pointed out that on the issue of Brexit, he can speak out all he likes anyway. It'd be a strange thing to resign because he can speak out.
And has
which suggests it is really about the disability cuts. Suzanne Evans.
Yes, well, that's certainly the theme that's picked up here in The Sun. Aussie shambles is the major headline here. Iain Duncan Smith apparently talking about how Osborne held a gun to his head. Pals of Mr Duncan Smith has he said, every time there's a spending round, they come to me with a loaded revolver and say, give us a couple of million quid. It's like being victimised because no other department gets this. Health, education, defence are all ring-fenced. Of course, the foreign aid budget isn't touched. The EU budget cannot be touched. So I think that the message very much here is that for Iain Duncan Smith, this was the final straw. He reached the end of his tether and had simply had enough of Osborne. And you know, I have every sympathy with that. We call him Osbrown in the UKIP Parliamentary Resource Unit because we think he's actually carried on Gordon Brown's legacy. You know, the national debt has doubled. 5 government departments now. It's a bigger interest payment than talking about that. You know, he hasn't reduced the deficit as he said he would. He's been
You've also got the Mirror there just below. Just talk us through the Mirror has a characteristically forthright front headline there.
Absolutely fascinating cartoon here. He's wounded. Now finish him. This amazing cartoon. I suppose for some people it's probably not going to look very funny, of Iain Duncan Smith knifing Osborne in the back, watched on by Michael Gove, Priti Patel, Boris Johnson. I presume that's Chris Grayling, although I have to say it doesn't seem to bear much of a resemblance to him, but I presume that's who it must be. I think this does show that, as the headline says right at the top, blundering Osborne is out. I think the way he's behaved has shown he's not in touch with the ordinary people in this country. His budgets have been devastating for many of the sort of middle classes who have traditionally voted Tory. I think the Tory party's in crisis this morning.
One of the reasons that Duncan Smith criticised his budget was precisely that it appealed to the middle classes.
Yeah.
Well, I think he was talking more about the fact that the cuts to the disability benefit and to the welfare budget were being used for tax cuts.
Yes, I think the right's a bit confused on
I'd like to move now to the Mail on Sunday, which is a fascinating double-page spread of Nick Wood, who's very, very close to Iain Duncan Smith, giving the IDS point of view, and Ian Birrell, who's been very close to David Cameron, having a real hard go at him. It's a petulant, self-serving hypocrite, he says.
Well, the point that comes out of Ian Birrell's piece, which is impassioned not least by the fact that he has a daughter of his own who's severely disabled, is that Duncan Smith has been involved in cuts involving the disabled for quite a while, 6 years in fact, and was, let's not forget, responsible for the work capability assessments that ATOS so disastrously bungled, and indeed ATOS had to be pulled. This is the private contractors that ran the tests had to be pulled out of. So one has to be a bit careful before suddenly seeing Iain Duncan Smith as a kind of hero of the disabled rights, who's decided he's up with this, he will not put after 6 years.
Except for he has now resigned over this issue. I mean, it is gloriously counterintuitive. So you have Ian, Birrell, who regards himself as part of the so-called modernising wing, arguing against Iain Duncan Smith, even though it's Iain Duncan Smith who has resigned in protest against these cuts, and arguing that the Osborne agenda has shown that we are not all in this together. So it's quite hard. I know Matthew believes that the Osborne-Cameron project is absolutely on the centre ground, but I think these phrases like the centre and modernising are not helpful at all, because they lead us down these blind alleyways. Who is the moderniser in this case? I mean, Iain Duncan Smith often was in alliance during the coalition with Nick Clegg against George Osborne's welfare cuts.
He's supposed to be on the hard right of the Tory party, and yet here he is resigning over disablement rights. Ian Birrell's piece seems to me he agrees with Iain Duncan Smith on a lot of that, but says it's really about Brexit, it's really about a coup underlying it all.
Well, I suspect that to be true, but also in Iain Duncan Smith's letter, he says explicitly that he has nothing against the actual package of reforms. What he didn't like was their presence in the budget, which makes you feel that really this is more of a turf war than an issue of principle.
I think it's more of an
Well, there's a reason
ideological
for that. We'll
war,
come to
actually,
it.
because I do genuinely think that, rightly or wrongly, and whether he went about it in the right way or not is arguable, but I think Iain Duncan Smith does genuinely see cutting welfare and encouraging people into work as a good thing and trying to make people more self-reliant, and that's always been a typical Conservative message. I think the point is that George Osborne has seen the welfare budget not as something to help people into work and help them onto a better life, but more of a cash cow.
Right, there's a lot of that cash cow phrase repeats itself again and again in the papers. I'd like to take you on, Suzanne, however, to the David Laws story, which is in the and this is a really, on another day, this is the story we'd all be talking about, because at its essence is the notion that this £9 billion extra for the NHS that we were all talking about through the election, I interviewed George Osborne about, we endlessly talked about it, that figure was a fraud.
Well, it's interesting because when I was writing the UKIP General Election Manifesto, we did wonder where this 8 billion, 9 billion figure had actually come from and how that was going to be filled. It now transpires, according to the Mail on Sunday, that in fact the chief of NHS England was saying there was in fact a 16 billion budget black hole, but he was gently persuaded, perhaps we can put it like that, to actually get that back to 8 billion. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because it was always NHS figures. It was Simon Stevens who was saying that that was his figures, but perhaps that actually wasn't the case. Perhaps, in fact, this was a political move. So, as you say, on another day, I think this would have been a very, very big story and not just relegated to page 8.
I agree it's a big story, and the lesson of this big story is that every single figure that dominates these pre-election tax and spend debates should be ignored. I mean, you've spent your entire life, Andrew, on this sofa interrogating people in the 2 years before an election about 8 billion, about 28 billion for this. They are all mythical figures that bear no relation
Very
to
hard
what's going to
for me,
happen.
Steve, to say I'd like to ask you about a mythical figure, but I take your point. I'd like you to pick up very quickly, if you would, on the Independent, last Independent on Sunday. Lots of very, very good reads in it, but including an interview with David Cameron, which I think is, on another day, it's been slightly underplayed. It's a fascinating interview.
Well, and in it, I think David Cameron starts talking about how close this Brexit campaign could become and how dependent it will be, as ever, actually, on turnout and the degree to which people get out to vote. So, yeah, it is a significant moment because there is absolutely no pretense that this is going to be an easy, one-sided campaign. It evidently isn't.
You've got the quotes there, I think, Matthew. This is the Prime Minister saying what a lot of people have been saying.
My fear is turnout. A lot of people might think, well, in the end, it's the rational thing to stay, but I'll let other people make that choice for me. Cameron goes on, don't. This is very close, no doubt about it.
Very interesting to have Cameron at this point in the referendum saying explicitly this is very close.
Yes, they're obviously very worried about turnout.
Right, very final thoughts on the Indie on Sunday, a paper which struggled against the odds, never quite cut through to the mainstream, but is adorned by some of the finest writers we have. What do you think?
Very sorry to see it go. It's always sad when a newspaper goes.
Yeah, no, very sad. And it's a stylish front page, isn't it?
Yes.
The lights out. With I mean, they were always well known, as with the Daily, for the rather stylish covers and use of photography. And that's a rather beautiful, elegant
I think that's where they always, perhaps with the Sun, always had the edge of the front page. For me, the standout one is the Hutton report, the white page and the word whitewash. That was brilliant. But can I just ask you, Andrew, because how do you feel? Because of course you were.
I feel
editor.
dead gutted.
You must be gutted.
I love the Independent. I love many of its writers, Coburn, Fisk, Sengupta. There's lots and lots of people who I will have to read online now, and it's not quite the same. I want my coffee beside the paper. On that elegiac note, however, we have finished the paper review. Thanks to all of you.